The Newsmax studio in Boca Raton, Florida hummed with its characteristic partisan energy on this Tuesday evening, as producers prepared for a special town hall event that had been promoted as a forum for discussing the state of American politics, the upcoming presidential election, and the cultural battles that the network's predominantly older conservative audience viewed as threatening their values and their vision of what America should be. The event would feature Donald Trump Jr., who had transformed himself from real estate executive and reality television personality into a prominent MAGA movement figure through his aggressive social media presence, his willingness to attack his father's opponents with rhetoric that even Donald Trump sometimes avoided, and his positioning as a leading voice of a younger generation of conservatives who embraced confrontational politics and culture war positioning without the restraints that more traditional Republicans might observe. The network had also invited Representative Jasmine Crockett to participate, a booking that reflected either genuine interest in presenting multiple perspectives or more likely a calculation that featuring a progressive Democrat would provide Trump Jr. with an opportunity to demonstrate his confrontational style before a sympathetic audience that would reward aggressive attacks on a black progressive woman whose advocacy for racial justice, criminal justice reform, and democratic accountability represented everything that MAGA conservatives opposed and feared. Donald Trump Jr. had built his post-2016 public profile on a foundation of aggressive partisanship that made few attempts at persuasion or coalition building, and that instead focused on energizing the MAGA base through attacks on Democrats, mainstream media, establishment Republicans viewed as insufficiently loyal to his father, and anyone who questioned Trump family claims or who supported investigations and prosecutions of his father's alleged misconduct. His communication style combined inherited elements of his father's approach, including personal attacks, nicknames designed to demean opponents, and complete disregard for factual accuracy when lies served political purposes, with social media fluency and willingness to engage with internet culture and meme warfare that his father's generation did not fully understand or effectively deploy. He had no significant policy expertise and had never demonstrated interest in the detailed work of governance or legislation, but he had proven effective at generating conservative media attention and at rallying Trump supporters through rhetoric that validated their grievances and that characterized political opponents not as people with different views but as enemies who threatened America and who deserved contempt, rather than respect or engagement. His decision to participate in a town hall with Jasmine Crockett reflected confidence that the friendly Newsmax environment would allow him to dominate exchanges and to score political points through aggressive questioning and personal attacks that would resonate with the network's audience, even if they failed to persuade anyone not already committed to MAGA politics. Representative Jasmine Crockett had accepted the Newsmax invitation despite advice from some Democratic strategists who questioned whether appearing on the network served progressive interests or simply provided a platform for MAGA attacks, while reaching an audience so committed to conservative narratives that no amount of effective advocacy would change their views. She had decided that declining would be characterized as fear of defending progressive positions before hostile audiences, and that appearing would demonstrate confidence in her positions and willingness to engage anywhere with anyone, and she had prepared for the event by researching Trump Jr.'s patterns of attack, identifying his typical rhetorical techniques and the likely lines of criticism he would deploy, and developing responses that would not just defend against his attacks, but would turn them back on him by exposing his lack of substance and his family's corruption and hypocrisy. She understood that the Newsmax audience would be predisposed against her and that the format would favor Trump Jr., but she calculated that effective performance could generate clips and coverage that would reach beyond the immediate audience, and that would demonstrate to progressives and to persuadable voters that Democratic positions could be defended, even in the most hostile environments, by advocates who refused to be intimidated and who came prepared with facts and with willingness to aggressively challenge opponents rather than simply playing defense. If you want to see what happens when someone who has built his identity on aggressive personal attacks and on family loyalty to a twice-impeached former president, facing multiple criminal indictments, attempts to mock an opponent who has prepared not just to defend herself, but to expose his lack of qualifications and his family's corruption in ways that turn his attacks into self-owns that shut down his entire strategy. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, because what unfolded during this Newsmax town hall would demonstrate exactly why inherited privilege and social media followings do not substitute for knowledge or integrity, and why some opponents who seem formidable within friendly environments collapse. when facing someone who refuses to be intimidated and who has done the homework necessary to expose their weaknesses. The event began with both participants delivering brief opening statements. Donald Trump Jr. focused his remarks on attacking the Biden administration, defending his father against what he characterized as political persecution through weaponized prosecutions, and criticizing progressive policies that he claimed were destroying American cities and values. His statement employed familiar MAGA talking points delivered with sneering contempt for Democrats and progressives, and he made several references to radical leftists and to policies that he characterized as socialist or communist, without providing specific examples or evidence. His performance played well with the studio audience, which applauded enthusiastically at his attacks and which demonstrated through their reactions that they viewed the event as entertainment and tribal affirmation rather than as serious policy discussion. He concluded by suggesting that he looked forward to hearing how Representative Crockett would defend the disaster of progressive governance and the witch hunt against his father, framing that positioned him as the questioner, challenging her to justify positions he had already characterized as indefensible. Jasmine Crockett's opening statement took a notably different approach, speaking not to the hostile Newsmax audience but to the broader audiences who would see clips of the event, and to the moderator and to Trump Jr. himself about the nature of the discussion they were about to have. She noted that she had come to Newsmax despite knowing the audience would be predisposed against her because she believed in engaging across ideological divides and because progressive positions could be defended with facts and evidence, regardless of the hostility of the environment. She emphasized that she would focus on substance rather than on personal attacks and that she hoped Trump Jr. would do the same, though she noted his opening statement suggested he might prefer performance to serious discussion. Her statement was professional and measured, calculated to make her appear reasonable and substantive, in contrast to Trump Jr.'s aggressive partisan rhetoric, and it set up the dynamic that would characterize the exchanges that followed. The moderator began the question portion by inviting Trump Jr. to question Crockett about issues of his choosing, a format that heavily favored him by allowing him to set topics and frame questions while requiring her to respond. He immediately launched what was clearly a prepared attack, designed to generate the kind of viral moment that would circulate through conservative media, and that would allow him to claim victory, regardless of how substantively she might respond. Representative Crockett. He began with exaggerated formality dripping with contempt. I have watched your congressional antics and your media appearances, and I have to say, you remind me of the kind of person who got participation trophies growing up, and who now thinks showing up and being loud makes you qualified to legislate. He paused for audience reaction, which came in the form of laughter and applause. You talk about criminal justice reform, but you have never run anything, you have never built anything, you have never created jobs or met a payroll. He leaned back with a smirk. So my question is, what makes you think you are qualified to tell Americans how to run their country, when your only real skill seems to be complaining about how unfair everything is, while pushing policies that would make everyone as dependent on government as Democratic voters already are? The attack was multi-layered and designed to be devastating, questioning her qualifications and competence, characterizing her as entitled and unaccomplished, suggesting her policies reflected desire to create dependency rather than to solve problems, and employing the kind of personal mockery that had become Trump Jr.'s signature style. The audience responded enthusiastically, recognizing that he had delivered exactly the kind of attack they had come to see and that they hoped would embarrass and humiliate the progressive Democrat who had dared to enter their ideological space. The moderator looked pleased with the confrontation, apparently viewing it as good television regardless of whether it generated illumination, and Donald Trump Jr. sat with his characteristic smirk, clearly confident that he had scored points and that Crockett's response would either be defensive and weak or would be angry in ways that would confirm conservative stereotypes about angry black women who could not handle criticism. But what none of them had anticipated was that Jasmine had prepared specifically for personal attacks on her qualifications and had developed a response that would not just defend her background, but would devastatingly expose Trump Jr.'s own lack of qualifications while connecting that exposure to his family's broader pattern of corruption and failure. She smiled slightly, an expression that those familiar with her previous confrontations recognized as indicating that something was coming that her attacker would regret having provoked, and when she spoke her voice carried the dangerous calm that signaled complete confidence in the destruction she was about to deliver. Don, she said, using the diminutive form of his name deliberately to signal she would not treat him with deference or respect. Thank you for that question, which tells me a lot more about you than it tells anyone about me, but I am going to answer it directly. And then I am going to ask you a question about your qualifications, since you decided to make this about who has accomplished what, and who is qualified to have opinions about governance. She pulled out materials that she had brought specifically for this purpose. You just suggested that I have never run anything or built anything or created jobs. So let me describe what I have actually done before entering Congress, and then let me describe what you have actually done, and we can let everyone watching decide whose background better prepares them to advocate for working Americans and to understand how systems actually affect people's lives. She began reading from a summary she had prepared. After law school, I spent 6 years as a public defender in Dallas County, representing over 400 clients whose freedom depended on my knowledge of constitutional law, criminal procedure, and my ability to navigate a system that systematically discriminates against poor people and people of color. She looked up at Trump Jr. I managed a caseload that would overwhelm most attorneys. I supervised junior lawyers and investigators. I negotiated with prosecutors. I litigated against government attorneys who had far more resources than my clients had. I tried 50 cases to verdict, which means I convinced juries of citizens to side with my clients despite opposition from the full weight of state power. She paused. That is running something, Don. That is building something. Specifically building defenses that gave people their freedom back. That is, creating value. Specifically protecting constitutional rights that are supposed to belong to everyone, but that are often denied to people who cannot afford expensive attorneys. She set down that document and picked up another. After my public defender work, I ran for state legislature in Texas and won despite being outspent and despite running in an area where Democratic victories were difficult. I served in the Texas legislature where I passed legislation that actual people benefit from. Then I ran for Congress and won again. She looked at him. So before you dismiss me as someone who just shows up and complains, understand that I have done the work, I have won elections, I have passed legislation, and I have represented people whose lives depended on my competence and my knowledge. She paused before delivering the transition that would set up her devastating counterattack. Now let me describe your qualifications, Don, since you decided to make this about who has accomplished what. The studio had grown noticeably quieter as Trump Jr.'s smirk had faded, and as he apparently recognized that his attack had invited a response he had not prepared for. Jasmine continued with systematic precision. You were born into wealth, the son of a real estate developer who got his start through his father Fred Trump's fortune and through discriminatory rental practices that the Justice Department sued him for in the 1,970 seconds for refusing to rent to black tenants. She held up documentation. You attended private schools, and you went to University of Pennsylvania, where you have admitted you partied heavily and where you graduated without particular distinction. After college, you went to work for your father's company, not because you had demonstrated competence or business acumen but because you were his son and he gave you a job. She looked directly at him. You have never had to apply for a job where your last name was not Trump. You have never had to convince someone to hire you based on your qualifications rather than your family connections. You have never built anything from nothing, Don. Everything you have because your father gave it to you. She pulled out additional documentation as the audience sat in uncomfortable silence. And let's examine your track record in the family business. Trump Organization has been found liable for fraud. It has declared bankruptcy multiple times. Your father has faced thousands of lawsuits from contractors and workers he refused to pay. She paused. And Don, you personally were involved in the Trump Soho project, which was marketed with fraudulent claims about sales that led to lawsuits and settlements. You were involved in Trump University, a scam that defrauded students and that resulted in $25 million settlement. You coordinated with Russians during your father's campaign to get dirt on his opponent, a meeting you initially lied about before being forced to admit it when evidence emerged. She looked at him with complete contempt. So, when you question my qualifications and my accomplishments, understand that your entire life has been defined by using your father's name and money while contributing to projects that defrauded people or that failed despite every advantage wealth and connections could provide. The silence in the studio was now profound and uncomfortable, with the audience apparently shocked into quietness by the comprehensiveness and directness of Crockett's attack. Trump Jr. sat visibly stunned, his earlier confident smirk completely gone and his face displaying a mixture of anger and embarrassment as he struggled to formulate any response. The moderator looked uncertain whether to intervene or to allow the exchange to continue. But Jasmine was not finished, and what she said next would be the line that would shut down not just Trump Jr.'s specific attack, but his entire presence at the event, and his broader claim to any authority or credibility on questions of qualifications or governance. So, Don, here is my answer to your question about what qualifies me to advocate for Americans and to push for policies that would improve their lives. She leaned forward. I am qualified because I have actually worked for a living, because I have represented people who face real struggles in systems that are rigged against them, because I have won elections without inheriting my position, and because I have passed legislation that helps people rather than defrauding them." She paused and delivered the knockout line. "You are not qualified to question anyone's credentials or accomplishments, Dawn, because the only reason anyone knows your name or listens to anything you say is that your father is famous, and the only reason your father is famous is that he inherited money and then spent decades building a brand on reality television and on self-promotion while running businesses into the ground and stiffing the workers and contractors who actually did the work." She sat back. "You are the definition of a participation trophy, Dawn. You showed up with the right last name and you have spent your entire life coasting on advantages you did nothing to earn while attacking people who actually had to work for their accomplishments." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. The kind of moment where everyone recognizes that something definitive has been said that cannot be unsaid and that has fundamentally destroyed the credibility of the person being addressed. Donald Trump Jr. sat frozen, his mouth slightly open but no words emerging, his face having gone from red with anger to pale with what appeared to be genuine shock that someone had responded to his attack, not with defense, but with such a comprehensive dismantling of his own background and his own claims to competence or accomplishment. The Newsmax audience, which had been enthusiastically supportive of Trump Jr.'s opening attack, now sat in stunned silence, apparently uncertain how to react to seeing their champion so thoroughly humiliated by someone they had expected to see defeated. The moderator eventually intervened to suggest they move to a different topic, but the damage had been done and the fundamental dynamic of the event had been irreversibly altered. The remainder of the town hall proceeded with questions from the audience and from the moderator on various policy topics, but Donald Trump Jr. was noticeably subdued and defensive throughout, his earlier aggressive confidence completely gone and his responses lacking the force and mockery that had characterized his opening. Jasmine dominated the subsequent exchanges not through similar personal attacks but through substantive answers that demonstrated command of policy details and through continued willingness to challenge Trump Jr.'s claims with evidence and with direct questions about his positions that he struggled to answer without either contradicting himself or admitting positions that would be politically problematic. The event concluded with brief closing statements, but observers recognized that the defining moment had occurred when Crockett had turned Trump Jr.'s mockery back on him with such devastating precision that everything afterward occurred in the shadow of that exchange. The immediate reaction on social media and in news coverage was explosive and overwhelmingly celebrated Crockett's response as one of the most effective takedowns of a Trump family member that had occurred in the political media. Clips of the exchange were viewed hundreds of millions of times within days, with the hashtags Crockett Destroys Jr., Participation Tropidon, and Shut Down completed trending globally. Progressive organizations and Democratic activists celebrated the exchange as demonstrating how to respond to personal attacks from privileged opponents by exposing their lack of actual accomplishments and by demonstrating that inherited wealth and family connections were not accomplishments, deserving respect or deference. Many commenters expressed particular satisfaction at seeing a Trump family member face the kind of aggressive personal exposure that the Trump family had deployed against countless opponents over the years, and they noted that Crockett had used Trump Jr.'s own technique of personal mockery more effectively against him than he had ever managed to use it against others. Conservative media responses were notably defensive and struggled to frame the exchange as anything other than a comprehensive defeat for Trump Jr. Some attempted to characterize Crockett's response as inappropriate personal attack or as defensive deflection from substance, but such characterizations failed to gain traction, given that Trump Jr. had initiated the personal attacks and had specifically made the discussion about qualifications and accomplishments, inviting exactly the comparison that Crockett had provided. Several prominent conservatives privately acknowledged that Trump Jr. had made a serious mistake by attacking Crockett's qualifications, when his own background was so vulnerable to the kind of exposure she had delivered, and some suggested that Trump family members should be more cautious about engaging with prepared progressive opponents who could effectively challenge the family mythology of business success and self-made achievement. The exchange also generated extensive discussion about inherited privilege, meritocracy, myths, and the role that family, wealth, and connections played in determining who achieved prominence and who was taken seriously as political commentators or as business leaders. Several analysts noted that Trump Jr. represented an extreme example of a broader phenomenon where people born into wealth and connections achieved positions of influence, while people who actually worked for their accomplishments faced skepticism and demands to prove their qualifications. Crockett's systematic documentation of how Trump Jr. had benefited from inherited advantages at every stage, while contributing to failed or fraudulent enterprises, provided a powerful case study in how meritocracy narratives often obscured the reality that success frequently reflected initial advantages rather than talent or hard work. For Donald Trump Jr., personally, the Newsmax humiliation represented perhaps his most significant public defeat and seriously damaged his positioning as an effective MAGA messenger who could dominate progressives through aggressive attacks. His social media presence remained strong among committed Trump supporters, but his ability to command mainstream media attention and to be taken seriously as a political commentator rather than as a privileged heir trading on his father's name was significantly diminished. Several media organizations reconsidered whether booking him for appearances provided value or whether his demonstrated vulnerabilities made him a liability who would generate negative attention. Some conservative strategists began questioning whether Trump family members were actually effective political advocates or whether their prominence reflected nepotism and cult of personality rather than genuine political skills or policy knowledge. For Jasmine Crockett, the exchange further cemented her status as one of the most formidable progressive communicators and as someone who could not just survive but could dominate in the most hostile environments against the most prominent conservative figures. Her willingness to respond to personal attacks by aggressively exposing her attackers' vulnerabilities and her systematic documentation of Trump Jr.'s inherited privilege and failed enterprises demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to turn attacks into opportunities for devastating counterpunches. Democratic leadership continued to deploy her in high-profile confrontations, recognizing that her combination of preparation, argumentative skill, and fearlessness made her uniquely valuable for defending progressive positions and for going on offense against conservative narratives and personalities. The exchange had also revealed important lessons about effective political communication and about how to handle personal attacks from privileged opponents who assumed their status or family connections would protect them from equivalent scrutiny. Trump Jr. had employed a strategy that had worked for him in friendly media environments where hosts and audiences supported him and where progressive guests often responded defensively to personal attacks rather than counterattacking with equivalent force. Crockett had demonstrated that such tactics were vulnerable when facing opponents who had done research on their attackers' backgrounds and who were willing to expose inherited privilege and actual records rather than accepting characterizations based on self-promotion and family mythology. Her response provided a template for how progressives could engage with Trump family members and other privileged conservatives who claimed success and competence while having benefited from advantages they refused to acknowledge, and while, having contributed to failures and frauds, they wanted to obscure. Years later, when analysts assessed the Trump family's role in American politics and the evolution of MAGA movement messaging and tactics, many would point to the Crockett-Trump Jr. exchange as exemplifying both the movement's reliance on personal attacks and inherited status rather than on policy knowledge or genuine accomplishments, and the vulnerability of those tactics when facing prepared opponents who refused to be intimidated. Donald Trump Jr. had assumed that his aggressive style and his family name would allow him to dominate a progressive Democrat in a friendly Newsmax environment, but he had encountered someone who understood that inherited privilege was not accomplishment and who had prepared to expose that reality in ways that could not be dismissed or spun away. The comprehensiveness of his defeat had demonstrated that Trump family members were not invulnerable and that their claims to business success and political acumen could be systematically dismantled by anyone willing to examine their actual records rather than accepting the mythology they promoted. If watching Jasmine Crockett respond to Donald Trump Jr.'s mocking of her qualifications by systematically exposing his inherited privilege, his lack of actual accomplishments, his involvement in fraudulent enterprises, and his dependence on his father's name for everything he has ever achieved, and seeing that response shut him down so completely that he could not recover for the remainder of the event, made you understand why inherited wealth and family connections do not substitute for actual qualifications or accomplishments, and why responding to personal attacks from privileged opponents requires exposing their vulnerabilities rather than simply defending yourself. Then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we will continue covering the advocates and communicators who refuse to be intimidated by famous names or by aggressive attacks, and who are demonstrating that effective opposition to privileged bad faith actors requires challenging their claims to competence and status by documenting how they actually achieved their positions and what they have actually accomplished beyond being born into the right families and inheriting advantages that most Americans never receive.